Good evening. Welcome to the third in our series. Today we welcome our very own Reverend Robin Tapper, and Sue will do the proper introduction. And she's promised faithfully not to drift too far away from the lectern. And so hopefully the microphone situation will be third time's a charm. As usual, if you've parked in a parking space that is labelled St. John's Church and you don't normally, then give me a wave and we'll add you to the parking ticket system. Otherwise, there's an hour in the bays outside, and that's about our time frame, so that's fine. The toilets, should you need them, are through past the organ and in the far corner of the church. I've left the lights on so you can find your way. And the emergency exits are located behind you generally. Sue is going to be doing our more formal welcome and introduction.
Welcome everybody, and it's my pleasure. Can you hear me? It's my pleasure to introduce the Reverend Robin Tapper, who is attached to this parish as an Anglican priest, and is also a lawyer and has lectured in law for many years and has done a lot of mediation, I gather. And she's a fellow of the law school at the University of Western Australia. So we look forward to hearing what she has to say to us. So thank you very much, Robin.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you. May I check if anyone can hear me? If anyone can't hear me, hello, and it's lovely to be here. I believe that the timing will allow lots of room for questions. So if there's a bit of meandering, as there may be here, and you need clarification, please feel free to ask at the end. Thank you. So here we are again, considering how to live well, religion, law, and community. And my overall thesis, approach, is that law is essential for our living well in community, but law is not enough, and law can be misused and abused, including by religion. When law is misused and abused, the purposes of law are not met, not fulfilled. And there's a brief expression of this in these words from the Christian perspective, in the words of Jesus, where he's talking about the law of tithing. He says, "But woe to you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and herbs of all kinds, and neglect justice and the love of God. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others." So you got the law right, but they neglected the justice and the mercy of God. And the people being addressed by Jesus here are named as Pharisees, and I'm quoting in this description by the writer James Allison. He says, "They were not stupid people, they were not evil people. They were the best people, holding together the best religious system in the world. And at the time, the Roman legal system was the best legal system in the world. So what is it about law that I'm saying makes it essential and yet also not enough and also able to be misused and abused? And in this talk, I'm going to start with our civil law, our secular law, and after that, I'll turn to the Christian perspective and then bring some threads together. So what's our civil law for? What's it necessary for our law in the secular civil society to achieve its purposes. And I'm drawing from my experiences as a lawyer and, as Sue said, and as a law lecturer, but also from a few years when I worked for the Legal Practice Board of WA. That's the agency in WA that supervises legal practitioners, and that my work included investigating complaints against lawyers. But particularly I draw tonight from my work, which built on that, about a decade ago when I helped to set up a new course at the law school at UWA in legal ethics. For final year law students, the course was called Legal Theory and Ethics, it still runs, and our intention was to encourage these students to understand that the rules governing their behaviour in practice, once they get into practice, the rules were aiming to meet the purposes of law, and that legalistic interpretation might not be enough. Why is law needed in society? Why can't people just cooperate with each other without rules? Just talk together, sort things out. There might be many answers to this, but I'm going to draw on a couple of legal scholars. Here's one. Human beings have drives, desires, and interests which tend to be incompatible. Longings for food and resources, for freedom, for equality, for power, for justice. And people often don't have what might be needed, such as character, abilities, and time, for the infinite discussion that would be necessary to resolve all these issues. Law, I'm quoting here, law might help us to bring order to the chaos of value that we confront, but it does so by creating artificial certainty. That's where law's authority comes in. An authoritative decision has to be made. We can't go around all the time discussing how to cooperate about everything, so authoritative decisions are made. And there are jobs that law has to achieve to enable people to live in community. One theorist writes about law jobs, necessary. Law jobs not just for a state, a city, but every community, every family, every couple, a group of friends, a business partnership, a parish, a diocese, right up to a nation, an international community. There are jobs that have to be done by law to enable people to live in community. And most often people are used to laws being what tell us what to do, what side of the road to drive on. In this law jobs theory, this is channeling behaviour, laws which tell us how to behave. But that's just one law job. That law, people's behaviour needs to be channelled by laws, so you don't both drive on the same side of the road. I mean, that's obvious, but many aren't so obvious. But another one is the system, another job, law job, the system for resolving disputes between people. What happens when there's a fight? What happens when neighbours get into a dispute or there is a car crash? There has to be a system for resolving disputes. That's a second law job. So you need a system for that. Courts in the most highest level. But another one that often isn't thought of, the allocation of the say. Who has the say about issues? Who's going to have the say? In a family, sometimes you might have to toss a coin, or you have a system for allocating all sorts of things people might need a say about. And if you're going to argue every time about who has the say, so we have in law the allocation of the say. The most complex in Australia would be our constitution, which allocates the say for certain things between the states and the federal government. But there are many other situations where who has the say in a workplace? So that's another law job. Law has to do that, and it can be complex or simple. And there's another one, there are probably half a dozen or so, I'm only going to mention one more. Another one is the job of reviewing the system that's been set up to see that it meets its purposes. And so when I worked for the Legal Practice Board of WA, I was part of the system that reviewed whether lawyers were abiding by what they needed to do and so on. And so that people can get on with their lives without endless debate about their irreconcilable values, such a system must be trustworthy, or at least trustworthy enough. And I'm going to end this part focusing mainly on civil law by quoting from a recent paper by a judge of the Federal Court of Australia, Justice Craig Colvin. He was a law student at UWA when I was first lecturing there in the 1980s, now a judge of the Federal Court, and the Federal Court deals with mainly interstate and other issues. But he wrote this, and I'm quoting from him, about law and lawyers. He says, the practice, and I'll quote here, the practice of the law is not a technical discipline like engineering, which requires an expert understanding of tangible things. It's constructed by human minds to regulate human behaviour in all its complexities. For those who practice its administration and development, rules are insufficient guidance. Instead, lawyers need a keen understanding of the human condition and an engagement with the reasons for and rationale behind the law. So he's reinforcing that. And then he talks about what virtues lawyers need. And he discusses 10. Well, I'm going to list them. I'm not going to discuss them, but I'll just 10 virtues which he sees as intrinsic to practice as a good lawyer. And he says, an ethical lawyer is honest, reliable, candid, constructive, respectful, temperate, diligent, passionate, empathetic, and humble. Now that's saying when it goes right, and we know it doesn't always, but the point is it's essential to living well together in community. It can go wrong, but it matters. It is something that matters that it goes right. Now I'm going to move to a Christian perspective, though I don't think that's a million miles away, but, and it's deliberately, this part, a Christian perspective. So I'm not claiming this is the only Christian perspective on this topic. But in my understanding of the Christian tradition to which I belong, I just need, it's rather muggy, even with the fan. Excuse me a moment. Thank you. So in my understanding of the Christian, can I just check, are you hearing? If you're not, would you want to move up the front? I don't know what else to do. Thanks, Val. Good. Come on. Good. I'll keep trying to speak. Does it help when I speak down into the microphone, or is it just... Yes, come on up. There's lots of space up here if you're having trouble. Good. So in my understanding of the Christian tradition to which I belong, the giving of the law to humankind is an expression of the love of God. In the love of God, the creation and sustaining of everything that exists is a free gift. And for us human beings, the gift of freedom is essential. God did not create a universe for puppets to live in, puppets to be manipulated and controlled. But God calls people into faithful relationships of love and cooperation. And the gift of law is made to enable these relationships. And in the Christian perspective also, the law is essential. we know that with the freedom that is given to humankind, the possibility of abuse of gifts is also given. The abuse of law as well. As with so much else, even with our understanding of God, law can be turned into some sort of idol. So many things are given as gifts and become an idol, like law's the thing itself. What? No. God is the giver, and it's about God who is the gift. But the gift of law is given us for a purpose, to make it possible for us free human beings to live together in community. I'll say more about that freedom because I think it's integral, essential, and Jesus shows us how to live in that freedom. In this tradition, even before God gave the law to Moses in the form of the Ten Commandments, relationship is shown as what it's about. I believe in the first story of creation with Adam and Eve, in that great story, Adam and Eve being created in the image of God and then given freedom, even to do what they were commanded not to. Anyway, relationship is fundamental. So God met Moses by the burning bush. Even before the giving of the law, there is relationship. And God spoke to him, to Moses, as a person speaks to a friend, as one writer puts it. God patiently stayed in this dialogue, answering Moses respectfully and even intimately, calling Moses into faithful cooperative relationship. That's the model. We are called into faithful cooperative relationship. So what goes wrong? What goes wrong with the gift? And one way of putting it about law is that it becomes an end in itself and the true purposes are not met. It's no longer about the giver. And Jesus said, I came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, which confirms or reaffirms. This is a gift given, and he came to fulfill its purposes. So, the text from which I began, where Jesus said, you neglect justice and the love of God. It is these you ought to have practiced, he said to the Pharisees. It is these you ought to have practiced, justice and the love of God, without neglecting the others. That's crucial, without neglecting the others. And so those leaders of the best religious system of the time and the leaders of the Roman legal system could not resist the lynch mob that was calling for the death of Jesus. The leaders, I'm quoting here, the leaders were powerful elites acting in systems based on a top-down rule. They acted as if they were gods. Classic case where a lynch mob comes into being. Yet in the Christian understanding, we know that the true way of being of the one true living God was right in front of them in the person of Jesus. They got it totally wrong. And in the gospel story we hear after his baptism, Jesus was driven into the wilderness and he was tempted to behave like a god, like the deceiver was telling him God was like. Turn these stones into bread. Throw yourself off and God will send angels. Jesus was not fooled. He did not fall for the deceiver, unlike Adam and Eve in that original creation story, because there's a choice to know what God is truly like. And I'm going to turn to a teaching at the heart of the ministry of Jesus, which he lived out in his dying. Jesus said, be merciful just as your Father in heaven is merciful. And the long passage in which this is found is usually called the Sermon on the Plain in Luke's Gospel, parallel to the Sermon on the Mount. And you know it, but I'm going to read an abbreviated form. Jesus said, I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. Love your enemies, do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. And then he said, consistent with all that, do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back. The end of his words, or the end of what I'm quoting, so much. This is the heart of the gospel. Be like this, you will be like God. And he showed it in his living and dying. Do not judge, forgive. That is what it is to live in faithful relationship with God. So having given us the law, in Jesus we see that God's love is so great that God is willing even to bear the burden of the abuses of the law. Even those who put him to death, he was willing to bear the burden of the abuse of the law in order to keep the hope of loving cooperation, living well in community, that the law was meant to bring about. And this is how we live with the law, meeting its purposes. We're not called to do unto others just as the letter of what the law tells us to do. We're to share with each other the love and mercy of God revealed in Jesus, who forgives even as he bears the burden of the abuse of that legal system which has been corrupted. So where is the justice in this way of being? In this way, acting justly is a virtue. It's a virtue called into being in us, basic to being able to live together in community. Not just following the rules, but a virtue in us. And a virtue is a stable disposition, a way of being that becomes habitual. And Jesus showed this virtue. Now, a virtue must come to us, first of all, from others. We can't create it for ourselves. And so the development of virtues in children is a primary task of child rearing by parents and others in the child's community. But in whatever way, each one of us receive virtues from others and then develop it in ourselves. And so these virtues are not merely individual. While law is essential for just living, for justice, living in justice, regulations do not in themselves bring about that living in the Christian perspective as well. And Jesus showed how we are to live. So with faith, in other words, faith also is produced by someone else's trustworthiness. Jesus shows us in being the forgiving victim, the ultimate trustworthiness, so we can become faithful because we are taught how to have that disposition. So in Jesus, the purposes of God are fully revealed. Humankind has been created to live together in love and community with God, with each other. The law has been given for the purpose of that living together. But in the freedom of God's gifts, people turn the gift into a moralizing burden and a religious burden. God does not require our moralizing, Jesus says. Do not judge and you will not be judged. It's about living. And I think out of context I'm going to quote something, but it may not make sense. I'm just quoting, secularization is the wonderful gift which the gospel of Jesus has brought into an over-religious world. I'm going to leave it there. But Jesus shows our moralizing is not needed. So the mercy of the one true living God is most fully shown in Jesus, who becomes the victim of the legalistic and moralizing crowds and who reveals the trustworthiness of God's mercy. And Jesus said, I've not come for the righteous, but for the broken, for those who've gone astray. And in his dying, he said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And in this, he took away the power of death in his rising. Death is no longer the capstone of meaning. That's another story. And then the new message is spread, and I'm going to turn to two quotations of St. Paul, which exactly come to this. So from Colossians, why do you submit to regulations? He quotes the regulations. Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. He says, all these regulations refer to things that perish with use. They are simply human commands and teachings. They have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-imposed piety, humility, and severe treatment of the body, but they are of no value in checking self-indulgence. So says Paul. And then from the letter to the Galatians, turning to virtues again, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is no law against such things. And those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live by the Spirit, let us also be guided by the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, competing against one another, envying one another. And Paul goes on, my friends, if anyone is detected in a transgression, you who have received the Spirit should restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness. Take care that you yourselves are not tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. So there is a sense of, yes, law is essential, but it's not enough. It can go wrong. And I'm going to turn really to a sort of law with justice and mercy, civil law, which I think is consistent with those Christian teachings. I'm not saying that these current developments in civil law have been caused by Christian teachings, but I think there's certainly an influence. But let me say what I'm talking about. I'm just going to talk about three. One is therapeutic jurisprudence. It is a worldwide movement of law reform, often called TJ, therapeutic jurisprudence. It's grown out of years of experience of lawyers and judges about the effect of legal processes on the well-being of people caught up in the law. The burdens caused by many of the ills of society are borne by those working in the legal system. And those people need to take care of their own well-being so as to promote a legal system that promotes the well-being of participants in it. So this movement began in the United States with mental health law, issues in mental health law, but now most countries in the world have therapeutic jurisprudence sections, including in Australia. And it's been a long-term interest of mine. About 30 years ago, I gave a paper entitled The Lawyer as Peacemaker, and then about 2006 at an international therapeutic jurisprudence conference in Perth, a paper on the peacemaking virtues of good lawyers in the adversarial process. So even in the courts where people are fighting, what are the peacemaking virtues of good lawyers? And I interviewed judges and senior lawyers and as part of therapeutic jurisprudence, but there are so many. That was a small thing, so many around the world. This is aimed at bringing the law to serve its true ends without losing the character of law. So that's one, TJ, therapeutic jurisprudence. Another you may be more aware of, some of you, restorative justice. You would know of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, which is one of the most amazing restorative justice, and probably it's educated so much about restorative justice. When apartheid was brought to an end, a commission was set up. One of the commissioners was our Archbishop, Desmond Tutu, Anglican Archbishop. But the point was, telling the truth of what went on is the only way healing can come. So no just cheap forgiveness, saying sorry, everything's all right now. Telling the truth about the suffering that apartheid had caused from the people who had suffered and those who had caused it listening. And That's the only hope of healing. And the practice of restorative justice in smaller ways has become part of many areas of criminal law. And I'm quoting from the International Society for Restorative Justice. Certainly you may have seen programs on TV about this in bringing together victims and offenders. And I quote, "Restorative justice views crime as more than breaking the law. It also causes harm to people, relationships and the community. So a just response must address these harms as well as the wrongdoing. If the parties are willing," underlined, if the parties are willing, "the best way to do this is to help them meet, to discuss these harms and how to bring about resolution. If they are unable or unwilling to meet, there are other approaches," but the quote goes on, "sometimes those meetings lead to transformational changes in people's lives." And the third I want to talk about, and Sue mentioned it in her introduction, mediation. I might slip into the word meditation because that's very important, but here I'm talking about mediation. And where there are disputes between people or among groups of people that are not criminal, the practice of mediation is part of some legal processes, and it only takes place if the parties are willing. And a main aim is so people are in dispute. Family law is one area where it can sometimes be helpful, though it's difficult. It's to give those who are in dispute a way of coming to their own settlement of the dispute. So it's not just imposed from some judge. It is a way of equipping them, empowering them to work out between themselves. And that's quite difficult, but it usually aims to, if they're willing, have a mediator who will help them speak about what their experience has been. And then after each person has been able to do that, and the others have shown they have heard, it's very... And then there's a consideration, what might the options of settlement be? What might happen that might bring this about? And they might have to go away and think and come back. And there's also time, all sorts of, obviously you can hear how difficult this is. But the question is there any way they can reach an agreement that is their own agreement so they can move on with their lives? Not ideal for either of them, but at least their own. And the trained mediators can come from many backgrounds. In a phase of my work when I was a mediator and coaching trainee mediators, it was sometimes lawyers who found it most difficult because it's hard to be a mediator if you think you've got the answer to what the problem is before you start. You've got to give the people the chance to talk. And that can be hard for lawyers, law students to say, oh, it's not my solution. And I used to find psychologists were much better at the listening, but found it much harder, as mediators I mean, much harder then to come to the resolution, help the parties come to a resolution between themselves. Now that isn't always the case, I'm just... So, those are some areas today in civil law. And as I say, I'm not saying the Christian gospel has brought those about, but it has certainly had an effect on it. And I know I did some mediation training with Father Michael Pennington here, thank you, way back, but it's part of, there is some shared. So in my understanding of the Christian tradition to which I belong, the giving of the law to humankind is an expression of the love of God, and law is essential for relationship, for well-being between people and God and each other. But as I said, and I'm repeating what I started with, it's not enough, it can be abused. And in the love of God, the creation and sustaining of all that exists is a free gift, and it's essential. That's why the law is essential to be the way it is, because it's a gift in freedom. It's not someone fixing it from outside, just going back to that mediation example, not God sorting it out. We're not puppets of God. God wants us in relationship, and over again in the Torah, in the prophets, but certainly in the Christian, in Jesus' ministry, relationship is essential. An inscription I saw recently, this is the law part. The law is what it is, a majestic edifice, sheltering all of us, each stone of which rests upon another. How's that for a grand image? But we can take for granted what we have in our legal system and how much it benefits us in the peace we live in. So let's not take it for granted. And I think also, just as medicos, people in hospitals, nurses, bear the pain of physical suffering and try to bring physical healing, in the law, police, judges, lawyers bear the pain of dispute, of conflict, of law breaking, and have to be supported in bearing that. And when in our prayers we hold doctors and nurses, we hold lawyers, this is a bearing the burden of others going on. And so many people in so many walks of life do this. So, how amazing the love story. I'm going back to our Christian perspective now. How amazing the love story on which our Christian faith is founded, some of it shared with other faiths. The gift of creation given and humankind created in the image of God. A gift in freedom to be like God and yet also free to choose false images of God. To be misled by the adversary, as in some stories you have the adversary misleading Jesus in the wilderness about the true nature of God. The gift is given is freedom. We are called but not forced. The gift of law is given into that freedom to guide people into the way of justice and mercy, which is God's way, the ways of neighbourly love and cooperation. And into a world where those gifts are abused comes Jesus, to lead people to see the true nature of God and reveals it in becoming the victim of those abuses. He's willing even to bear the cost of the abuse of law and to bear it in forgiveness. And in this, he shows the depth and breadth of God's love and the true meaning of community into which we are called.
Thank you, Robin. We have time for questions now. Does anyone have a question?
We often speak, well, perhaps the kind of popular opinion seems to be that in the Western world, a lot of our legal systems are based around the traditions of the faith that was dominant and prevalent while law was being kind of codified, civil law was being written down and codified and worked out. What, purely from your experience of both faith and law, what do you think the Jesus of the Gospels would make of the laws, civil laws, that have been written down supposedly based on his teachings? And part two, do you think that kind of mediation and therapeutic jurisprudence are actually a kind of effort to reclaim some of that human element into something which has become quite faceless?
Don't know is my first answer. And the first part of the question, there are reasons why in certain parts of law, I don't think, in experience in the legal system, which some might think is faceless and hard, there are purposes there. And for instance, the rules of evidence are there for a purpose because we don't want lynch mobs. And I know that's putting it at too far an extreme, but I'm sort of groping around a bit because I think it's too easy to personify what seems, if you're not in the middle of it, heartless. Whereas in fact the cost of those who administer the legal system into seeking to get, not to get people convicted unjustly, get it wrong, but trying to. So anyway, I have a bit of a reaction against that description there. Don't know is though. I'm not saying it's all. Obviously, I'm not saying the whole system's ideal, but I think it's. So just one example of how it's hard to tell from the outside, which is not answering either of your questions. But for a while, I was working in the Crown Law Department in the section that dealt with appeals for conviction or sentence, and working with appeal. So all the documents, so there's a trial, someone's been convicted and sentenced, they bring an appeal, this is one example, bring an appeal to usually the federal court, the High Court, and I was assisting getting the papers together to respond to that appeal on behalf of the Crown. The point is, I want to make, if you read the media reports of what had been going on, you wouldn't recognise what had happened. So I'm just saying it's very hard to see from the outside. And part of the reason, it wasn't that anything was false. Often it wasn't that there was something false in the media reports. This is the point I want to make. It was what was left out. It's easy to look on what goes on as if it's all... It's because in the media reporting, a lot is left out of the grind and the efforts to make it just. I don't know if that's going anywhere with that. I don't know that, I certainly think in terms of the second part about therapeutic jurisprudence and mediation and so on, it is trying to be more human because of the cost that's seen to people. So it started with just, when it was informal, therapeutic jurisprudence, seeing that time out for a witness was helpful. Now this seems so small, but it's just small, it started small. So I don't know that it came from a grand theory, any sort of theory. It was seeing the inhumanity, trying to do it as well as possible in a way that's just, and yet seeing the inhumanity. I don't think that answers your question at all, but you could try again, but I probably won't do any better. That was tricky, Patrick, thank you. Any questions or? Yes, hi. Hi, Liz.
I think you've touched on it a little bit in that last answer, but
Can I come down next to you and hear it, and then I'll come up here and speak, because I can't hear. But you want to be able to hear too, don't you? I'll repeat it.
If I speak right into it, is that better? No.
I'll try.
I've got a loud voice, so I can shout anyway.
Thanks, Liz.
I'm really interested in this therapeutic law aspect, having been a palliative care nurse, and you can guess where I'm coming from with this. I really struggle as a Christian evaluating ethics and law. It's something that is in the palliative care movement, there's so much discussion about, well, obviously assisted dying and so forth. And I find this is really a real struggle for someone who's a Christian who takes seriously thou shalt not kill and so forth, and yet respecting the ethical views of good people, and many of them Christian people, who have the same struggle. But eventually some of these matters come into law, and is that troublesome in terms of being a lawmaker? Sorry, that's a bit waffly, but you can see where I'm going.
No, I think so. So just to clarify, so is it that just taking the example of assisted dying, when law is made that seems unethical to those who are called on to practice in that area. Now, it may be a nurse in an area where assisted dying is possible, but it may be a lawyer in a system. Where the rules seem to be, to the particular person, to be unethical. While respecting, I think you said, while respecting that there are going to be different views about ethical standards, and there you are in the middle of, but your own Christian view is this one, and how to respect? Is it about how to hold that space? How to reconcile, yeah. Yeah. Yes. No. No. Yeah. Yeah. It can be enacted in a law enacted, just so those who perhaps can't hear. It might be enacted with the best of intentions, but there are those who are called on to work in that system for whom it's unethical, for whom it's improper. And that's, I would think in some cases there has to be room for conscientious objection, if that's the phrase in the, so the issue of capital punishment was one. Obviously, it was for lawyers but look, I don't have an easy answer to that. I think that maybe others have thoughts about it for discussion among yourselves, but afterwards. But yes, it is a real issue. The process of drafting, preparing laws, tries to take those things into account. I'm talking about those who actually draft but I certainly, I think I'm in a. Yes, it's difficult. I don't think I have it is difficult, but there must be room for conscientious objection in some issues where it's a crunch. I can't think of any in. Yeah.
Saying they will not have anything to do with abortion on their premises, and I think I have huge respect for that, because I think they have made it clear what their view is.
Yes.
But it's interesting that a lot of people with a good ethical feeling about it don't agree. But I think, well, they are putting into their practice what they think is the right way. Sorry, it's difficult. It's difficult. I think in many areas, ethical issues, and they're often less obvious than those people in work. I'm sure you have many teaching, and anyway, yes. I don't have a statement in response. Yes, it is a real issue. Sorry, Liz. It's Don.
I want to talk about the Pell case. I don't want a judgment on Pell. That's
sorry, the what, Don? Talk about the
Pell.
Oh yes, okay.
Yeah, other things. What I feel has happened is that there's been a lot of movement towards believing victims, and yet there seemed to be some legal thing that said no, because there was only the one person. We won't believe him in other things. How well is these ideas put to the public? We get the newspaper or the radio or the television.
Yeah.
You get certain things from them, which is usually just to be emotional and not really filling out the details.
Yeah.
How much are we looking at? How much should we believe the victim how much are we looking at the person is innocent until proven guilty?
Yeah.
I'm sure the
Yeah.
law is tackling those sort of problems.
Yeah.
How does that get out to the public?
They are real issues, and there are some going on, aren't there? I mean, that case, it wasn't about just there being one victim. It's about is the evidence provided credible, sufficiently credible, and and there are reasons for rules of evidence, and they're to do with against lynch mobs. So, I mean, if you read those judgments are on the public record. So if you want to read the decision of the High Court and what the reasons were, they're on the High Court website. So it's not like they're hidden. So there was a case in Western Australia not so long ago where an Anglican priest of this diocese was convicted of abusing choir boys and convicted, imprisoned, no appeal because it was perfectly obviously credible. I was there just for the sentencing and had some connection with the case, but he hadn't abused them in this diocese, but he was a priest of this diocese when he was imprisoned. The thing is, that case, there was not the controversy, it was in the paper, but the point I'm making is the rules of evidence are there for a reason, and if you read the decision of the High Court, which was relying largely on the decision of a dissenting judge in the federal court, I find that it's clear, it's not just there is just one, it is what is the credibility, how can we believe beyond, because remember it has to be beyond reasonable doubt, which loads it against complainants, I agree. Very difficult, but the alternative is, what is the alternative? That it's the stirring up of emotion in people becomes the test. There must be something in between, but I think in some recent cases we've seen the media stirring up emotion and part stories put. That's how it's more like a witch hunt than a. So, but it perhaps related to Patrick. It seems very cold when you look at the decision of the High Court in the Pell case for the victim. But it's not denying they're a victim. It's just you cannot, because what you're trying to do in a trial. This is the point. You are asking for the whole power of the state to be put on a particular side of a case. That is police, prisons. So it's not just lifting a pebble, it's saying all the power of the state should be enforced. And that's why the standard is high. So, rules like hearsay evidence, you cannot, with exceptions, you cannot give evidence in court of what someone said to you because that is unreliable, cannot be tested as to what was really meant. Anyway, I'm going on a bit, but I'm saying if you read the decisions, or perhaps you will see that it's not just light. It is. Anyway, I think the rules of evidence, cold or whatever they are what safeguard us from the lynch mob, and I am glad we have them, and they are for a reason. Like I say, if you want to get the whole state behind putting someone away, let's have a high standard for doing that, which is beyond reasonable doubt. And that's the point. But, I can send you the link of, it's worth reading a judgment occasionally and seeing. I think it's quite, if you pick the right one, of course. Is that any help at all, Don? I don't know. Sorry. Yes. Context, can I just check I'm hearing? I didn't hear the first. Context. So look at the ancient world and now our contemporary world. Yes. It's a nice broad brush. Go on. It's a broad brush. Carry on, please. Put the microphone in front of your mouth because I can't really. Yep. I think that illustrates the need that in our world government, as well as in every community, there needs to be law. And that is a particular source of law for a particular purpose. It is not, human rights law, yes, absolutely. It's one aspect of human rights law. There are many, and I'm not an expert in that area. But as far as Christianity goes, the same point applies. It needs to meet its purpose, like any law. It can be abused, and I don't think I have an answer to what would Jesus say about that particular law, save that. So,
just to follow up briefly, I'm not trying to labour the point, and I won't ask anything further. But the document's not lengthy, but it covers a lot of issues.
Yep.
One, again, taking just one instance rather than trying to go through it item by item. We don't have to be an expert to appreciate the intention of the document with respect to freedom of religion, for example.
Yes.
And that includes Indigenous traditions, it includes the world great religions, it includes the diversity that exists today, which did not exist for the contemporary times in which the Bible was written. For example, today we have tens of thousands of denominations of Christianity, according to the internet. I assume it's right. We have 4,000 distinct religions in the world. You know, this is not a repeat of the past. This is a new set of circumstances we find ourselves in today. It's not more of the same, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So I won't say that.
Yeah, fair comment. I do think, though, that part of the point is about, if we're talking legally, enforcement of international law. So that's a point. I think if, and I don't think you're saying this, but if you were saying, should Jesus have expressed an opinion on what everything might be in the future? I'm sure you're not saying that. There are ways of reflecting on that, but I wouldn't do it in terms of what Jesus might have said if he were here now, I don't think. So I'm sorry if that's not helpful.
I'm going to leap in with one final question, which is, when it comes to living well together, which is part of our theme, it seems that a kind of key part of that, when it comes to the law, would be that we are all treated equally in the eyes of the law. Do you think that Christians should be exempt from parts of civil law in the name of religious freedom? Not by means of making this a kind of partisan kind of conversation, but in terms of law, community, and faith.
It's an admirably general question about what sorts. I think equality depends on relevance. I mean, we're not going to treat children the same way as adults. We're not going to, I know that's not, but I do think it is so if you're talking about, you'd have to take examples. I don't think I could deal with it generally, but, which I don't, equality before the law. I mean, in a war, there are reasons for conscientious objection. Give me an example and I'll...
Discriminating against people on the basis of gender because of a fundamental religious belief.
So it's a question is freedom of religion and equal treatment of, depending on the current state of thought about what things are to be considered as relevant. Like I'm saying, it depends on the circumstances, what's relevant. Look, I can't give a hypothetical answer to that because I think it is very, it's very difficult and it depends on the particulars. And if the whole question, for instance, of, it came up with marriage of gay couples and were the Anglican Church going to do it, and was it discriminatory if we didn't? And I mean, these are difficult questions because there's freedom of religion there's freedom of... anyway, sorry. I'm on a don't know evening. I think that is, it's really important to work out, but the details of working it out, living in community well, is sometimes the way in which we work it out, the virtues which we bring in order to work it out, and in other words, not like being willing to listen, being willing to be truthful, being willing to change our minds if that's... but I don't think... No, I don't know any more than that. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you all.
Thank you, Robin, for opening up a very complex area. And it's good to go away with more questions than you came with. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Sue. Thank you. Thank you all.
Oh, next week, sorry, before you go, everybody, next week, Dr. Amir Ali is coming next week to talk from an Islamic perspective. He's had extensive experience on international committees and was the chair of the committee advising the Howard government back then. So he should be a very interesting speaker. So hope to see you next week.